What's up, Internet? You're tuning in episode 153 of the FlipScreen Games Podcast, a weekly video game podcast where a few best buds from different nations come together to discuss the wide world of video games. I'm your host, Pete Bessie, joined today by my very good friend and co-host, Mr. Steven Radford.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Steve. Welcome back.
Yeah, well, I should be saying welcome back to you. You weren't here last week. How was your vacation?
It was nice. I took a little trip with my in-laws. We went and rented a lake house and got some nice family time, cooked some good food, went out on the water. It was a great I played some Steam Deck. It was a great time.
Oh, what were you playing?
A little bit of that Marvel Midnight Suns. You remember that game?
Yeah, the like Marvel XCOM game.
Yeah. My good friend Jack, who I've mentioned on the show in the past, if you're a longtime listener, he picked a copy up for me when shortly after it came out because he had really been enjoying it and was like, "You got to play this. Like, it's Marvel Fire Emblem. You'll love it." And yeah, just hadn't had like the itch for it, the gap in the schedule, right? It's like I was in the mood for something that I could kind of like dip in, dip out of, and like be playing in a room with other people. And yeah, I mean, I've really been enjoying it. I'm looking forward to talking about it at a greater capacity, maybe on one of the other shows at some point. But I'm having a really good time with it. It's a lot of fun.
Don't think it's for me, but I'm glad you're enjoying it.
I don't think it's for you either, but
Yeah.
if you're a XCOM or a Fire Emblem, tactical RPG type of person and you like Marvel, I think you'll enjoy it for sure. I think my favorite thing about it has been that it feels like kind of like a pre-MCU game. Like it's definitely like based on comics lore and it makes nods to things in film sometimes, like in passing, but like it's definitely a lot more connected to, the original states of the characters and then remixed a little bit for the setting at hand. So yeah, it very much feels like a game from like the Xbox 360 era, but like affectionately.
Well, speaking of old console eras, we're going to be talking all about the Genesis today, the Sega Genesis, otherwise known as the Mega Drive, because it turns 35 today, Pete. How old do you feel when you hear that?
Not too old because the Genesis is like before my time,
Yeah.
so I'm like, I'm not that old. Yeah, it's all right. It's an old console, but I'm not that much younger than it.
Yeah, well, this is a celebration of the North American launch. Like all the consoles in the '90s, seemingly it launched in different countries at different times. So we're just doing
It
it
was
based
hard to
on
launch a
North
worldwide
America.
product back then, man. Yeah, I'll tell you what, folks, we're gonna be talking about it a lot, but in Blake Harris's Console Wars, which is like all about the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis era and the back and forth between the two companies, there's a whole chapter about them coordinating the worldwide release of Sonic 2 and how insanely difficult that was at the time. So it's like we kind of take worldwide launches for granted now, but up until a couple years ago, they were not even standard.
Yeah, but this wasn't even like not a worldwide launch. It like launched in '88, then '89, then 1990, and they were like
Yeah.
years apart, not even months apart. I mean,
No.
and this was a console that didn't cease production because it was still for sale in Brazil by a company called Tectoy until like 2020, something like that.
It's a beloved console. I mean, it like I think no matter what way you slice it, whatever your opinion of Sega prior or now, right? Like pretty much their entire identity comes back to the Genesis Mega Drive era.
But
Um,
because I think that's their best era. I mean, this was their final
yeah.
successful console. After this, everything was
I
downhill,
mean, it was also
really.
their first successful console if you really want to get
I think the Master System was a success for them in some markets. Like, you can see from the people who wrote in on from our community that the UK market was clearly pretty big for the Mega Drive.
sure, but even by that metric, it was big in the UK compared to Nintendo, but it's not like what PlayStation ended up becoming in the
No,
UK
no.
or like what PC gaming was in the UK at the time, right? Like even so, it was niche comparatively, right? And like the Genesis was there was a time where they had dominant market share, right? Or where they had like a 50-50 market share with Nintendo. And they were a real legitimate competitor that more or less came out of nowhere and, totally built on the efforts of the like American Sega of America team, right? And them being this like, scrappy small team that didn't have that much money and didn't have the same like level of clout or resources and had to rely on doing things that were, you know, um like different or offbeat or attention getting. And like that leads to all the most interesting things about the Genesis, including stuff like Sonic the Hedgehog, right? Like all of it comes from that very like 90s specific like attitude of marketing and everything. And like that's still what people remember when they think about the highs of Sega. Granted, there are plenty of games made by Sega later or now, right? Like obviously stuff from Atlas and everything is great, but it's like, you
Or even
know,
their, like, arcade heritage, because I do think they were known for their arcade stuff, and the Mega Drive was able, or the Genesis was able to bring some of those to the home as well, like,
yeah,
the ports of Outrun, for example.
sure.
Um, we'd never seen proper arcade games really in the home until Donkey Kong came to the NES, and then now it's like now we get Sega's version of it.
Well, and I think the big thing too is that like, Nintendo in like the post video game market crash, right? Like they kind of had to strong arm their way back into living rooms and everything and kind of revitalize the games industry. And a lot of that was having this very like controlled image, this very family friendly image, this, you know, especially in the beginning, like we sell toys, right? Like that was with Rob. Like the whole reason Rob was a packing with the NES was to trick toy stores into carrying the thing. And Sega like just went the total opposite direction, right? And they like were like, well, we want to be for teens and adults, and we want to make stuff that's, kind of controversial and that I think is for as much of that stuff, I think was like schlock and shock rather than quality. A lot of it did, I think meaningfully push the industry forward and kind of challenge the notion that video games were just for children.
I mean, that's pretty much the core of what a lot of Sega's marketing in this era was. Like their Genesis does what Nintendo don't, and the focus on like made up things like blast processing to show that they could
Mode
have video
7
games.
versus blast processing.
It's like they could have video games that Nintendo couldn't or wouldn't allow on their platform. Famously, Mortal Kombat, for example, the better version I think most people would say is on the Genesis. The blood's red, not green, and you've got the proper kind of fatalities at the end. And games like Night Trap, which was very controversial at the time and led to Sega having to make their own video game ratings council, which eventually led to the ESRB, and video games having ratings. Like, I think a lot of people don't realize or forget that the video games was kind of just like a free for all at this period of time. It was just completely unregulated media, and you could just, if you wanted to make a game, as long as the manufacturer was willing to print it onto a cartridge, you could put it on a store shelf.
And I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like prior to Sega coming out and creating a viable alternative to Nintendo, the Nintendo seal of quality was the seal, right? Like that was the
Mm.
rating system. That was the thing by which, these games were judged. And it was the trust that people had in Nintendo as a company that, you know, kind of was able to like create a new foundation for the industry to come back. And Sega kind of did, rock the boat quite a bit, right? And like created all this like negative attention from parental watchdog groups and Congress and, all these organizations that, had this real moral panic over the idea that video games were dangerous and that they were corrupting children. And like Sega was very much they were the ones with the target on their back. Their games were the ones that were raising these questions. And, I think there are things that we look back on now and they might seem kind of tame compared to what we see today, right? But like, yeah, I mean, they were trailblazers in so many ways, even if a lot of their kind of, you know, like pomp and circumstance, I guess, a lot of the like way in which they carried themselves was overinflated. It was like posturing and like puffing their chest out, but like it worked, right? Like they created so much momentum from talking shit and from
It really was the birth of the console was that still goes on
yeah.
into this day of like, "Oh, I'm camp Xbox, I'm camp PlayStation," and people are just fighting about what box is in front of their TV and what games that box can play. But these consoles were different in many ways. Like, this was the era of exclusives, really. You know, either Nintendo made the game or Sega made the game, or you had some games that played better on other consoles than the other
But that
one.
were like totally different even. That was even,
Yeah,
because when we were coming up, there were plenty of exclusives, right? But a lot of multi-plat games, it would just kind of be
like the
like
Disney games were often like that. Like Aladdin, for example, would play
right, it's like
very
it's straight
differently.
up a different game on
Yeah.
Super Nintendo. I think Lion King was the same way.
Yeah, and I really like the Mega Drive versions of both of those games more than the SNES versions.
I don't think that's an uncommon opinion. I think most people would agree, at least about Aladdin. I see that said all the time.
Yeah, it was a very strange era. I wanna know, Pete, before we get in too deep, into the history of the console, what our history of the consoles were. Did you pony up, or did your parents pony up $189 when it's launched on August 14th, 1989, which would be $460 in today's money for a Sega Genesis?
Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about when y'all complain about video games costing too much. Because think about that. That's how much it costs, right? Then games still cost like $60, $70 back then. So do that math. All right.
I'll
That's
get the inflation calculator up while you tell me.
because that's
Uh,
something else. But no, I was yet not even a glint in my parents' eyes in 1989. So I was not around for the Sega Genesis. But I do have a relationship with the console, although it's a little bit more removed, just because I think like so many of us in the audience, right? Like you get exposed to the generations that came before you from older siblings or relatives or whatever. For me, it was always like friends, older brothers, or whatever, right? Like I've told the story before of like part of my video game origin was that I had my mother had a client when she was like an interior decorator, and she had a client that had two teenage sons that had a really massive video game collection. And I had a summer where I got to go and play games at their house while my mom was working. And like they had a Genesis, right? Or like, a couple of my best friends growing up had older brothers that had a Genesis. And, then when the newer consoles came out, right? Like they had a PlayStation. So the younger brother gets the Genesis. And, it was something where like I always kind of had access to the library and I got familiar with at least a lot of the kid friendly games. Just through kind of cultural osmosis, even though I didn't own one myself.
Yeah, I mean, that library became very accessible in like the Wii era as well with the Virtual Console. I think a lot of people became introduced to the games then. I know they were also on Xbox Arcade. We spoke about that
Sure.
on the Goodbye Xbox 360 podcast a couple of weeks ago. If you want to go listen about that, but I did own a Mega Drive, but I bought it at a car boot sale when I was like 10, or maybe my
Nice.
mum brought it home for me from work with a bunch of games. I think it was that. I think I remember her bringing it home. She'll be able to tell me. I'll get write in the comments, mum, if you did. But my friend Jack, who I've spoken about before, he had like every console, and I would go around to his house. He had like a Mega Drive with a 32X. He had a Sega CD, a Sega Saturn. He had all of it. He had like every peripheral for this thing, as well as like all of the Nintendo consoles. It was insane. I have no idea why he had them all and why he had so many consoles. Like, I don't know if his
Did
older
he
sister
did he
was
go
in.
outside? Was he an outside kid?
Yeah, he played football all the time as well, like, it's yeah, I don't know, but it was
That's
always
why
cool
I
to
had
go
them
into
all.
his house, like, which I totally get, but, like, he's our age, and so why did he have a Mega Drive and a Super Nintendo and
Yeah.
a
I don't know, maybe it was similar to you where it was like, snagging them at garage sales kinda thing.
possibly, yeah, or maybe his dad was into it, I don't know, and, like, he just got them from him because we had a Master System 2 in the house, and that's the only other console I remember having until we had a PS1, and then I bought the Mega Drive, or mum must have brought it home, after we had the PS1, and I remember plugging that in, and you had to, like, tune the TV in with, like, the RF signal. You'd have to, like, tune it to the channel, and it would, like,
Yeah.
hack onto it rather than using, like, the red, yellow, white cables. Yeah, it was fun. What were some of the games that you remember playing?
I mean, I think the obvious ones, right, are Sonic, right? Like Sonic 1, 2, 3, and and Knuckles are definitely the games that I would say I have the most relationship to. Especially considering they're so accessible after the fact, right? Like I
Mhm.
played them on other consoles a lot more than I played them on the Genesis. But I mean, aside from those, like you, I was into the Aladdin platformer quite a bit. But Mortal Kombat 2 is one of my favorite fighting games. I'm with you where that's the superior version for sure. Um and then Echo the Dolphin is
Oh
another one
my
that I
god,
remember
Echo the
spending a
Dolphin.
lot of time on. I had a next door neighbor, or not next door, but like a kid who lived in my neighborhood when I was growing up. And he was one of the ones. Older brother had a Genesis. He went off to college, left it behind with him. And Echo was like his favorite game. He loved Echo the
I
Dolphin.
never
So
I never got into it. I never got into it at all. But
it was one of
the
those, like, games, like, my biggest experience with it was, like, passing the controller back and forth, so it's like, I have a distinct memory of being, like, in late game when it's really hard, and I'm like, "I don't really know how to play this that well, dude," you know? It's like so, like, I have fond memories playing it with that friend, but it's not a game that I'm like, "Ah, God, I gotta get back to Echo the Dolphin," you know?
yeah, I
It's
I
a
think
cool story, though, I'll tell you that. If you've never read about, the creation of it, it's very interesting.
what's the I don't know the story behind it. What's the story behind it?
So, it's another one where there's a chapter about it in the book, and it's like the artist that worked on it was I'm pretty sure this is the only series he was ever the lead designer on, and it speaks to kind of, like, again, the very, like, funky, like, haphazard kind of nature of Nintendo of America, where, like, as the Genesis was rising in popularity, they needed more exclusive games. They were trying to like start incubating more games in America and not having to be beholden to the timeline of of the Japanese team. And also, there was quite a bit of friction between Nintendo of Japan and Nintendo of America. If the way that Blake Harris talks about it, it kind of very much is portrayed as if the Japanese side of the company was like jealous that like prior to NOA coming, or I'm sorry, SOA coming in and shaking things up, right? Like Sega had been in decline and right, really hadn't been successful. And Sonic was one of the characters that went under like a lot of iteration from with input from the American side of the company. And like there was this a lot of this kind of like back and forth of like you guys don't get what works in Japan and you guys don't get what works in America and America's our biggest market. So, and it was just like they were supposed to be an offshoot, but then it kind of became this big power struggle. And during that time where they were trying to kind of build up the status of Sega of America, one of the projects that got off the ground was Echo, and it was like the like lead designer, like I said, was this guy who just like had this idea and like did an obsessive amount of research about dolphins and like came up with this whole like weird space alien lore. And it's just a weird story. It's one of those just like game development used to be so much like less organized, you
Well, do
know?
you do you know what that guy, Ed, and Annunziata went on to go to do
And
after Echo the
Annunziata,
Dolphin?
that's it, thank you.
Yeah.
Uh, I don't know.
He was the executive producer for the N-Gage.
Yo, shout out to the end game.
Man, so, like, Sega goes down, he jumps ship, he goes over to Nokia, works on the N-Gage, and we know where that went.
Yeah, it's pretty sick.
The last thing he did was a game for the Nintendo Switch called Space War Arena. in 2019, but I've not.
I know he was trying to get I think he had a Kickstarter a couple years ago to try to get a new Echo going, and I don't think it ever materialized.
I could see that coming back. It's a bit of a cult classic, so people seem to really love
Totally.
that game, and yeah, I never got into it. For me, like, the big games I loved aside from, like, Sonic were, like, Streets of Rage. I loved Streets of Rage, like, just a side-scrolling brawler, absolutely loved it. Outrun was great, Space Harrier 2, but the one I distinctly remember playing a lot of, is not even a exclusive to the Mega Drive, is Zombies Ate My Neighbors
Oh, sure.
by
Yeah,
Konami. I
of
love that
course.
game so much, it's so good. I remember playing that with my brother all the time.
It's not that similar, but, like, that one reminds me of another game that I had on my list, which was, Tiny Toons Acme All-Stars. It was, like, a similar, like, kind of like, I remember sitting there playing with friends, like, two-player, just kinda, like, like, real, like, fun, like, level, kinda, like I don't it's like what's the word I'm looking I don't know, I guess just that it's arcadey. It's like that kind of, like, fun arcadey tie-in game that, like, you used to get back in the day, right? When it was like, well, we don't have to worry about, like, voice acting or, any of these things that, like, end up making these games expensive or make them feel cheap, and it's just like it's just a good brawler, a good platformer, and happens to have this recognizable cartoon character in it? There's
Yeah.
so many of those games back then that were fun.
Oh, no, yeah, I kinda missed that, and they all had absolutely banging soundtracks as well, like, I have the Streets of Rage soundtrack on vinyl, I love it so much.
That's one thing that you gotta give the Genesis generally is that there's some killer soundtracks on some Genesis games. Like, I know you have a section here about, like, Michael Jackson's involvement with, like, the music for Sonic 3 and then,
Mhm.
like, like, Moonwalker and all that stuff, and it's just, like, the kind of, like, connection to, like, music and pop culture. Like, I know, like, that was, like, a thing at the time was, like, they had this vision of, like, "Oh, we're gonna release like, the video game soundtracks, like, as CDs and, like, that'll be part of the, like, kinda multimedia blitz of a game like Sonic," and
Which 100% should have followed through with that, like, those soundtracks are just so good. Sonic 3, nobody even knew Michael Jackson worked on it officially. It was, like, rumored for a very long time, and it wasn't until the re-release with Sonic Origins, they couldn't bring that music over to Sonic Origins because, they didn't have the licensing for it, because it came out that it was because Michael Jackson worked on that music.
yeah, well, and part of it too is that he didn't want it released, I think, because he was not satisfied with
What they've done with it, yeah.
the quality of it, yeah.
Which is fair enough. I mean, he's probably used to working on Thriller, and then now we've got to compress that down into, like, 16-bit
Yeah,
audio to come
it
out of the
definitely sounds a
speaker.
lot different.
Oh, man, yeah. There were some great games, and, like we mentioned, Night Trap and Mortal Kombat led to a huge thing going on in your country, right, Pete? Like, in 1993 to 1994.
Yeah, it was the kind of, like, major reckoning that the video game industry had to go through, which is something that I mean, it's kinda happened with, like, every major, like, art form in America. There's been, like, this happened with comics, it happened with rock and roll, it's like there's, like, this moral panic about violence and sexual content and this and that, and, um, this is actually the same thing that led to the Motion Picture Association ratings and everything, like, in America, right? Like, movies
Mhm.
are rated R, they're PG-13 or whatever, and, like, all of those like, any governing body like that usually comes after an event like this
Are
where
like motion pictures and say the explicit ratings on CDs, are they the same as the ESRB? Are they run by and kind of upheld by themselves? Because the ESRB is obviously it's basically the retailers, right? The software association, the ESA that runs it.
so, yeah, I mean, that's, like, literally what this kind of that's how the ESRB was formed, was, like, citing that legal precedent, right? Is basically like, with comic books, they had the Comics Code Authority where there was, like, a stamp that they would put on the front of a comic to say that it was being, like, Comics Code compliant, and that would mean that you couldn't have depictions of extreme violence or sexuality or, like, whatever, right? Like, was sanitizing things and making them more family friendly and more child friendly and yada yada yada.
Mhm.
And the MPAA was like a similar kind of thing where it's like, okay, if we don't step in and self-regulate, the government is going to come in and regulate and tell us what we can and can't do, and that's obviously not good for the health of the art form, right? To have government censorship being like a key part of how things go, right? Because I mean, shit, if that had happened back then, there could have been a legal precedent set that video games couldn't be violent or couldn't have sexual content, and then we wouldn't have the breadth of experiences that we have now, right? That are intended for adults and teenagers, people of all ages. So yeah, it's very, very similar, right? Where essentially what happened was that these watchdog groups were very concerned over particularly Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. And
And then Doom, I think, got put into the wash with it as well.
Doom came up, but I don't believe it was nearly as like focused because I know that like Night Trap obviously was, the content was like
It was
controversial.
FMV as well, like, if people don't know, that
Yeah.
was like it's a full motion video, you're actually basically watching a movie.
Yeah, and if you don't know, right, like it's an FMV of like basically like a slasher movie, right? Like it's like these like young girls are at a sleepover and like they're like getting chased around by a killer. And I think that that's again, it's the kind of thing that like by today's standards or even judging by like what film standards were in 1993, I don't
I
think it
mean,
would
when
be
did Scream come out? That must have been a not long
Ex
after.
exactly. It's that same kind of thing, but that this was very much in that time where it's like, well, video games are for children, right? Like, they are toys for children. We shouldn't be marketing violent sexual material to children, and, I mean, that's what the whole debate was about, right? Was that, Sega was asserting that, like well, Nintendo was asserting, "We don't do that, Sega does. Don't try to blame the entire industry, attack Sega." And Sega was like, "Hey, we make it very clear in all of our marketing that like these are products that are intended for older audiences and we're trying to court teens and adults and like we're not making this for the same audience that Nintendo's games are for, right? And we have games that are for that audience like Sonic the Hedgehog, but like these products are not for them. That's what led to the entire creation of the ESRB. And Sega had like their own board that they started and they tried to get everybody else to jump on it and Nintendo ended up basically acquiescing because they were like, okay, it's better for us to throw in with everyone else in the industry and be a part of this self-regulation than
Mhm.
allowing the US government to come in and dictate how we do business.
It's very strange that we kinda just let industry self-regulate, 'cause we do the same thing here, like, for games, it's PEGI, that's
Yeah.
across all of most of Europe. For movies, it's the BBFC, the British Board of Film Certification, and
I
that's,
think
like,
it's
its
hard.
own organization
I
too.
I think it's one of those things where like I don't think that that's a good thing for industries that are not artistic, right? Like I don't think it should be and
Like,
this is
"Oh, I'm buying a car, and all the car companies have said it's safe, so that's fine."
right. And it's like that's a whole deeper political, socioeconomic conversation that is kind of beyond the scope of this podcast. I think when you're talking about an artistic industry, though, it I think ideally you do want self-regulation because otherwise you're literally that becomes an issue of government censorship of art,
Mhm.
and that is a really slippery slope, right? Because you know, um, I'm trying not to get to like too extreme of a place with this example, but essentially, if you allow that door to open, right, then not only are you limiting the overall ability of the art form to grow, right, and evolve and to see video games become like the interesting, diverse, deep art form that they are now. Also, you run the risk of there being a situation where, like, well, what happens if like a watchdog group says that like any game that it has a queer person in it is that's too political or it's too sexual or it's too this or it's too that. And it's like that's what you risk, right? When you allow the government to dictate what can and can't be said because once it's a legal precedent, it's much harder to overturn something like that. Once you say that like this is the limits that we're imposing on games or movies or whatever, right? It sets a standard that can then be pointed to, but also creates a chilling effect because it's like I don't want to be in violation of these new rules. So I won't make art that pushes the envelope, or I won't make something that, you know, challenges those preconceived notions because there's potentially the threat of legal ramification, right?
Yeah, I mean, and they almost got there. Like, there was the Video Game Rating Act of 1994, which was put on the table, and it
That's what
didn't.
would have happened if it
It
wasn't
would have
for
happened, yeah.
this, you know?
Um, and and Night Trap did get pulled from shelves. They did tone it down and censor it a little bit, and then re-release it with the certification after the kind of, I think it was the VRC, and then later the ESRB was founded. But yeah, very strange time. Like, it's hard for me to think that these companies just thought, yeah, we could just put anything out. We don't need to put an age rating on these. But I guess at the time, you're looking at 8-bit graphics on the NES. Like, you're not really thinking about it. No one's looking at that and going, oh wow, that looks a bit violent, doesn't it?
Well, and I think it's also like, I don't know, it's just like that's what's so interesting about, like, golden ages of, like, art forms or whatever, right? Like, or anything, not even just an art form, right? But it's like, we were joking off air about, like, the way that like, video game ads used to be and how, like, sexual they were and, like, some of that kind and, just, like, um, how out of pocket some of it was. Like, there is this kind of, like, you know I think especially when you're an underdog, right? And you're like fighting against this like monolithic competitor that you're like just trying to gain ground against. It's like, yeah, I mean, well, there's no rules, right? So like how do you even know like, oh, like I can't believe we could do this. Like, well, who's saying we can't? Right? It's like they make movies about this. Why can't we make games about it? Like,
Yeah.
who's to say? Right. And ultimately, I think that ended up bearing out to be right, right? Like that was something that like the market clearly they filled a need that didn't exist at the time, right? And like they expanded the market in the same way that like we praised Nintendo for doing with the Wii, right? And expanding the casual market and bringing in more and more types of gamers. And like that was something that Sega was doing, right? It was bringing in older gamers and young adults and whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they definitely allowed more games on their platform than Nintendo did. They still had an approval and licensing system, though, and EA still kind of, clashed heads with them, because Sega would only produce a limited number of cartridges, but EA, like they did with the SNES, reversed engineered the the Genesis, and they just showed it to Sega. They were like just ahead of the 1990 Consumer Electronics Show, just said, "Hey, we've done this, and we're going to start our own licensing program if you don't kind of give us what we want." And they ended up getting as Trip Hawkins called it, a very unusual and much more enlightened licensing agreement from Sega.
That chapter in the book is so fascinating. And it's so like the like mentality of PC developers versus console developers, like, kind of rubbing up against one another because EA was like, a PC first um developer, right? Prior to this. And like obviously they ended up trying to put out the 3DO and everything. And it was like after that was when they really got into the console market. And that part of that was partnering with Sega and everything. And yeah, it's so wild that like it just again, it's this very like Wild West kind of thing at the time, right? That it's like we're all these young upstart companies trying to like claw market share, and that like they would just go to Sega and be like, "Yeah, we reverse engineered your tech, and we're gonna start selling it to people unless you cut us a deal." It's like that's insane. That's so crazy. Like, what a crazy story, right? And I'll tell you, man,
You
like
just couldn't get away with it now. You just wouldn't.
no, especially because again, it's just like there's like social media and stuff, right? Like the fact that all this could happen like behind closed doors and nobody even fucking knew about it is like unfathomable today, right?
Man, Trip Hawkins was really the man. Like, he just is just like, fuck yeah, I want to sell more cartridges. And he printed his own for the SNES with that weird little ugly tab thing, a yellow EA logo on there.
Like
But
he's one of those people where it's like like you're probably a genius and also seem like kind of like arrogant, but like you're smart enough. Like he's one of those people that's so fucking arrogant, but it's like he was smart enough and ahead of the curve enough that like it's like, what are you gonna do? It's like, I'm fucking right, you know? And it's like, okay, yeah, it's like, I guess so, right? Like, you can pull off bold gambits like that if you're that, technically, you have that level of technical prowess, and like
Yeah.
that was just something that at the time they had that talent base there. It's kind of crazy.
I mean, I kind of think that would have opened up the doors to for both Nintendo and Sega to have an antitrust lawsuit against them, that they're willing to print as many cartridges as they want for their own games, but third-party publishers get a limit on the number of cartridges that they print. It doesn't
I mean,
seem
that's the
fair.
thing though, right? Is like back in the day, like there was a reason for that. Because the whole reason that Nintendo did that was because the whole thing that led to the video game market crash was there not being quality control and there not being uh, you know, like, not just quality control in terms of, like, the quality of software, but also, like, how many games come out in a year, how many games are available on on the market at any given time, and the reason that they had such a tight grasp around that was because they didn't wanna flood the market with garbage software, and they didn't want companies to be, pushing out games all at the same time and hampering any one release's ability to succeed, and, like, that was just, I mean, again, like it's draconian. And I think, I get why if I was one of the companies under their thumb, I wouldn't have been happy about it. But I think there's an argument to be made that at the time it was what needed to happen to uh, foster trust in the industry again after the massive market collapse, and like a huge part of that was like the infamous titles like ET and, like Quaker Oats video game on Atari. And, it's like,
Hey, we still got Pepsi Man on the PS1, so I'm okay with that.
that's true. That's true. That's a classic, though. You know what I mean? It's like, uh, it's easy to I guess what I'm saying is I'm not trying to defend any given action, but it's like, I think it's easy to judge the actions of a different market by how the market is now.
Yeah.
And be like, "Oh, that's insane. That would never work today." And it's like, "You're right, but the industry is 30 years older now, right? It's so much more evolved now than it was. Distribution channels are more evolved, and video games are not a thing that people are like, "Ah, it's a fad. That's a flash in the pan thing that could go away." It's like, no, now it's like that'd be like saying movies are gonna go away. It's like they're not, right? Like it's like they might evolve, they might change, the margins might be different, the kinds of movies we're seeing, but it's like the art form is established. And I think now that that's where games are, yeah, like you look back at some of these like crystallizing moments and it's so easy to be like, holy shit, what a different time it was, just 30 years ago. But I mean, in an industry as young as ours, 30 years is a long time. That's like almost half the time that there's been video games.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, and looking back at it, these generations were short. You know,
Mhm.
the Genesis had its successor, the Sega Saturn, come out in 1994.
It's crazy because like they were short unless they weren't. But, like,
Yeah.
the average was a lot closer to, like, 5 years, and that's something that, again, we talk about all the time where it's like, I could they're "What? A new generation already?" It's like, I mean, back in the day, that was the turnaround. It's only recently that they became, like, 8, 10 years, like, that's a Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 global recession reason for that, right? Like, that's what caused that generation to be so long, and then now that's what we expect, and I mean, like, yeah, you look back at this stuff and it's just like, talk about the cost, right? Like, think about how the average cost of cartridges, too. I mean, I'm sure that influenced how many games they wanted to be on the market in a given year, right? Imagine how much that influences sales if there's 5 killer games out at the same time, but everybody can only afford to buy one.
Yeah, because I looked up how much it was. Would have been $150 per game in today's money.
So think about that the next time you complain about $70. Again, nobody wants to spend it, but fucking
And
A,
that's
man.
based on a $60 price point, which it was
Right,
back
some of them
then.
were more. Street Fighter 2 is a $70 cartridge.
Mm. Yeah, so yeah, it's crazy. But yeah, the
That
next
would have cost
generation
almost as much as the console.
but
Or no,
the
I guess
next
that's not true. With inflation, that's not the case. Never
no,
mind.
it's not, no. The next generation came out in '95 in the US, which was both the Saturn and the PlayStation. The
Man,
N64 followed after. But man, did Sega
I
stuff a load of console revisions and 32Xs and other sorts of bullshit.
I wanna do a video about this specifically so badly because I think it's so fascinating, like 'cause so, like, just to give you, like, a brief summary, I really suggest that you read Console Wars if you're interested in this story, or wait for my video, I guess, if you want it, tell me and I'll make it. But, Sega, like, coming off the Genesis, right? Like, they're, like, height of their fucking powers, right? Like, the Genesis achieved an insane level of market share. They've proven themselves a true competitor to Nintendo. They skirted this lawsuit, and they had very, very deep, serious talks to make the technology behind the PlayStation the next Sega console. And that ended up breaking down primarily because of that conflict I was telling you about between Sega of Japan and Sega of America. And Sega of Japan was where the R&D department was, and they were the folks responsible for developing the Genesis, and then later the Saturn, right? And uh, Tom Kalinske, who I can't believe we've gone this far without me mentioning, he was the president of Nintendo of America during their golden age. He was the one who had set up that deal with PlayStation and everything. And he went and looked at the consoles they were working on. And he was like, this is not good. Like the Saturn is not matching up to the competition. This is not going to be enough. Like we need something else. And that was when the PlayStation deal materialized. And literally the thing that ended up leading it to break down was ego, was the jealousy and the anger that the Japanese side of the company had towards Tom Kalinsky's team and towards Nintendo of America feeling like they were like wrestling too much control away. They were trying to steer the ship and all this stuff. And it was very much like a power move to be like, no, like, we're not going to go your way. We're going to go our way. And that's the last we're going to talk about it. And it's so crazy that between that falling through and then Nintendo doing what they did, which we all know, like, it's so crazy just how many opportunities there would have been for PlayStation to never have been a competitor.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, oh, man.
we'd still be buying Sega consoles today, maybe.
I actually no, we definitely would be, like, there's no way. I think the only
If they had
reason
maintained that relationship with Sony, then yeah.
even if even if that hadn't have happened and, like, Sony had gone with Nintendo, I still think there would have been 2 consoles. I think the Saturn would have been a dud, but I think the Dreamcast would have pulled it back. The Dreamcast
Maybe.
versus the GameCube probably would have done
But
better than the Dreamcast versus the PS2.
I don't even think PlayStation would have entered the market because the whole reason they wanted to work with Sega was because they had been investing in this tech, right? And they were like, I don't, do we want to bring a console to market? Like they were hesitant about it and they wanted a partner and they wanted to get in bed with somebody that was already established. And they had conversations with Nintendo that didn't materialize. So they went with Sega. And then they ended up going back with Nintendo. And they almost used that technology in the N64, which is crazy. But yeah, it's just nuts that it's like if but for the, you know, a slightly different blow, though, if it had happened a couple months earlier before they were trying to take control away from Tom, if it had happened, if they
It's
had
a
just
crazy butterfly effect to lead to the
yeah.
downfall of Sega.
And to the rise of PlayStation. It's crazy to think about how dominant PlayStation is now and that like they easily could have not existed. And think about this. This is even crazier. If PlayStation never exists, Xbox never exists, theoretically.
I think Xbox would exist. I think they'd want
Still
that
wanna
living
compete for
room
the living
still.
room?
Yeah, they still want the living room.
Maybe, but think about it. We watched the Xbox documentary, right? Always On. The primary reason they cared was because it was Sony that owned the
Yeah.
living room, and Sony was a competitor. They didn't think about Nintendo or Sega as competitive. Could they have maybe eventually? Sure, but, like, they might not have.
Well, and what's interesting is it was the PS2, that was taking over the living room, and a lot of the time it wasn't taking over the living room for video games, it was taking over the living room for DVDs, and they saw that as a threat. That's their inroad there. It's like, oh, it's a good DVD player, and it also happens to play games, and they've taken over the living room, and Microsoft wanted to get a slice of that. But man, the Saturn after the Genesis, what a absolute dud. $100 more than the PS1, crappy graphics,
That
terrible
PlayStation
controller.
399. What a mic drop moment at E3. Like, oh my god. If you've never seen that video, go watch it. It's the reveal of the PlayStation right after Sega did this whole big, "Here's the Saturn." They were, like, announced it at the last minute. It's coming out in, like, days, and it's like
Mm,
it was, like,
and
such
that
a,
fucked
like
them over as well. It's like, "Oh,
absolutely.
great, so we've got no time to plan for this," or
So many insane decisions made. And, yeah, and then PlayStation was just like, $3.99. That's it. They walked off the stage. That's the whole presentation. It's like, "What, are you kidding me? That's absolutely insane." It's another thing that would never happen today, right? It's like, "What, are you kidding me? That's ridiculous." But led to one of those moments, one of those iconic moments.
They had another one of those moments, though, Sony, with the, reveal of the PS4 price after Xbox One had just revealed the price of that with the
Well,
Kinect,
I
and it was
remember the
like,
game sharing video. That was a
yeah,
similar kind of like that was, "Oh, here's how you share games on PlayStation 4." And it's the
yeah.
game. There you
But
go.
they feel like such a different company from that era now,
Oh,
like, they
yeah.
really do.
Well, it's exactly what always happens, right? It's like when you're the underdog, you make weird decisions, you put personality first, you build up identity, and then when you're on top, then you're like, "All right, let's button things up. We're the corporate entity. We're on top. We're winning. We're the leader. We don't need to have a face anymore."
Yeah, it's a shame. It's a real shame. Did you like, encounter any of the weird hardware stuff they did, like the 32X add-on or the Sega CD add-on or
The
any of
CD
the
I did, yeah, I remember playing Sonic CD on that thing, and it was so weird.
yeah, like, plugs in the bottom and you're like, the CD drive comes out and you put it in.
And it's just like, if you've ever seen one of the ones where it's like, okay, it's got the drive, the 32X, like, it's like all of the different
Yeah.
it's like, it looks like a absolute goddamn monstrosity.
Yeah, it's really bad. It looks really bad. No, I never had any of those myself, but I played them over at my friend's house, and yeah, it was very, very strange to figure out what you had to plug in to get it to work.
Just the type of shit you don't get anymore. Like, it's so like, yeah, whatever, we'll
That
sell add-ons to the console instead of putting out new hardware because 'cause we're not ready. It's like,
that
okay.
ended with the GameCube and the PSP, I feel. They were, like, the last 2 consoles I can remember that had that stuff,
Yeah,
like the
the
Game
Game
Boy
Boy
Player.
player.
Mhm.
Yeah, which was awesome. That was so hot.
And then you could get, like, the camera that would plug into your PSP so you could, like, take
I don't even
pictures.
remember that. That's crazy. I remember the
Mm.
iToy though. That was on
Oh, the
PS2.
iToy was great. Yeah, I love the
Shout out to
iToy
them.
on the PS2.
All right, so we got a couple people who wrote in with their memories from the Sega Genesis slash Mega Drive, which I want to read here in just a second. But before we do that, let me remind you that this episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast is brought to you by our Patreon producers for the month of August. They are, of course, Arnold J. Rimmer, Christopher Valenz, Gabriel Hasselmeyer, aka Asobi, Steve Stompy, Susan Likes Cats and Also Boobies, Voodoo Vic, Ty the Dude, and Wakahula. Thank you all so much for your support over on patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. Y'all the realest of the real, and we greatly appreciate your support of this and all of our sister shows, which are the Nintendo Noise Podcast and the Steam Deck Podcast. If you want to go check those out, as well as all the other cool stuff that we're doing, or you want to show your support, however you want to get involved, head over to flipscreen.games. That's our website where you will find all the places we are. And we thank you for tuning into another episode of the show. This has been a fun one. I like when we get to take a walk through history, Steve. It's always a good
Yeah,
time.
it's fun. It's fun.
You and I are both like like we love this shit, you know? So it's like I love getting to take a walk on this stuff because it's like I can't when I was rereading Console Wars, or I guess listening to it a couple months ago, I can't tell you how often I'd just be like doing the dishes and I'd like pause and be like, "Sarah, do you want to hear this interesting thing about the Sega Genesis?"
You know, I get like that with this stuff. Henry will, like, just tell me stuff about Soviet Russia all day long. Like, he'll just be reading stuff on
Oh, history,
Wikipedia
huh?
about it.
The Roman Empire.
And I'm like, "Cool."
Trebuchets, Steve. All right. So let's jump into this first one. This one comes from Andrew Valentine, who wrote in and said, "It was my first proper console. Obsessively visited the only secondhand store in town, which was primarily, weirdly, a bike shop for whatever cheap games I could find. Obviously, my most prominent memories are of Sonic, and no one needs to hear someone of a certain vintage go on about that again. So I offer
Okay.
my other most profound Mega Drive memory, the game Cyborg Justice, side-scrolling brawler where you could harvest bits of your defeated enemies and attach them to yourself. I thought it was the sickest thing ever."
I have never heard of this game
Me
until
neither. It's awesome.
Andrew brought it up, and it looks incredible. I
It
kinda wanna play it.
it did remind me of another Genesis game that I did like though, which was Vector Man, which I didn't play that one until I was a teenager. One of my very good friends, when I was growing up, who unfortunately passed away, um, he had a Genesis, and I remember, like, "Oh, like, we're going over to hang out at his place," and he's like, "I hooked up my old Genesis. You guys wanna play Vector Man?" I was like, "What the fuck is Vector Man?" And it's literally like it was like their answer to Donkey Kong Country, and it's a very weird, like, blocky 90s ass platformer, but very memorable game, and, by many people's account, probably the last great game on the Genesis. So there you go. Vector Man.
Yeah, it came out in 1995. In
Yeah.
1996, Vector Man 2 came out.
Wow. I didn't know that one. On Genesis,
Crazy.
or
Yeah. Apparently,
wow,
they tried making a Vector Man 3 in the late '90s and early 2000s, but they were all cancelled by Sega.
rough. Poor Vector Man.
Didn't deserve it.
He didn't deserve it. He deserved better than that. All right. Shitty Foo wrote in and said, "Oh, nice. You mean the Sega Mega Drive?" Because I said, hit us with your Sega Genesis memory because I am an American and I apologize to all of you Europeans. But it is its American birthday, so I feel like it's okay to call it the Genesis today.
It is. I read. What do you know the history? Is that in console wars as to why it's called the Genesis and not the Mega Drive in the US?
I don't know. I remember the story of like I remember them talking about how it became Genesis. I don't remember them talking about Mega Drive. It is very like American kind of centric. Like they talk about Sega of Europe a little bit, but it's
Because it's
very
called that in Japan as well, and in
yeah,
Australia. Like it's Mega
literally
Drive everywhere.
everywhere but America. And I'm pretty sure that that was a Sega of America was like the Genesis is a cooler name for marketing purposes, and that is how almost every important decision of that era was made. Is somebody at Sega of America was like, "Wouldn't it be cooler if Sonic was like blue?" And they're like, "Yeah, it would be," and that was it. Which is why I think it's so damn interesting. So okay, favorite game or games were Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles. I mean, yeah, who could argue with that? I think easily the best games on the console. The ability to stack the cartridges was awesome. Even stacking Sonic 2 to play through as Knuckles was epic. The OG physical ROM hack. Yeah,
I'd
that's
completely expunged that from my memory that you
oh,
could do that.
really?
Yeah, I'd
It's
completely
so
forgotten
cool,
about it.
isn't it? It's so sick.
Yeah,
It's like they like added DLC to 2 games at once. Like such a weird like how did that even work?
it must just be like changing characters at like certain memory addresses on the card,
Yeah,
but it's so cool.
it's very cool. Booger Man gets a close second. Farts and burps as attacks is still hilarious. See, this is the thing about Genesis. Somebody will hit you with a game like, oh God, I really love Booger Man or or Cyborg Justice, and it's like, is that a real game? So, okay, great. So many great memories. My initial foray into asserting my dominance as the oldest child by making my younger brothers fly me around as Tails in Sonic 2 to skip difficult parts of levels. I feel like that's like a rite of passage for younger brothers, right? Like I had my one of my good friends growing up. It was like a my aunt's best friend's kid. It was like a cousin to me. He that was like him and his little brother. He would always make him be Tails and fly him past difficult stuff, or it would be like a boss fight, and he's like, "I only got one ring left. Like you got to go jump on him, and I'm just gonna dodge." You know, very cute. Introduction to sports sims via FIFA 96 and ARL 96, Streets of Rage, Goat Brawler. Oh, are you saying
It's the greatest of all time.
okay, that makes more sense. I
It
thought
is.
you were saying Goat Brawler as like a second game, and I was like, "What is Goat Brawler? Is yet another Genesis title I've never heard of." We need a Goat Brawler game, everybody. Mortal Kombat being so much better on Mega Drive than on Super Nintendo. Why do my Super Nintendo friends like slow, boring RPGs and exploration Metroid games when I can get intense action on the Mega Drive before the Ritalin kicks in? Oh man. That's funny. Why can't you like both, Shitty Foo? All right, that's my problem. This Sega versus Nintendo. Not sometimes I want them both.
I think you can only enjoy the slow, boring ones when the Ritalin kicks in. until then, you need the action.
See, and I don't buy that. As somebody who takes Adderall, I liked those slow games before because it was one of the only things that my mind would allow me to focus on. I'd like to comment that the PAL Mega Drive 2 Red Buttons is the best looking console of all time. And as an aside, why were 16-bit PAL consoles allowed some color while NTSC had to be blue and gray?
I don't get that. You had such boring consoles. The North American
I
Super
know.
Nintendo is so ugly.
I like it, but like I don't know if I like it because I like it or because it's like nostalgic and cool. But
I
yeah,
don't
I don't
know.
know. There was a real like that kind of aesthetic in technology at the time, right? It's like gray and plain and boring. Like, it's just like, it's not sexy, that's for sure. The
Yeah,
Genesis was though. The Genesis was cool. It was black and
yeah, and it had, like, high definition sound and a little headphone jack you could plug into with a little
yeah,
slider if you got one of the good ones.
it was cool. Like it had a coolness factor for sure. And
Yeah.
it's that one I'll give you. That is one of the coolest looking consoles of all time with the red buttons. That shit is fire.
I didn't realize that they weren't red in, North America 'cause I had a Mega Drive
They're
too. I had
gray, I
that
think.
exact console, and yeah, they are red. Or they're so red, they're almost orange, that kinda red? It's, like,
Yeah. It's like
so bright.
The OLED Steam Deck is like that, right? It's like that, like, burnt, like, hot ass
Yeah.
burnt orange, It's like, yeah, it's intense. I love that. All right. We're going to close things out with a comment here from the Largo Embargo who said, I still have a Mega Drive with about 50 to 60 games as I'm a massive retro nerd. Best games for me are Gunstar Heroes, Rocket Knight Adventures, two amazing runs and guns, and kids absolutely love Boogeyman, a toilet humored platformer
I
where the
think
main
this is the
character.
same game.
Yeah, it is. It's Boogeyman with the burps and the farts.
I never heard of it, and now 2 people have written in saying that they love Boogeyman
You
or
you
Boogerman.
missed something though. He had another comment about a McDonald's game that I thought was very interesting. What was that one called? Do you remember?
Oh, the McDonald's game? Yeah, I don't know if this was an actual release or if it was, or
Okay,
if
I
it was
got it. I
McDonald's
got it.
Treasure Land Adventure.
Okay, this was Chemical Flood who wrote in with this part. Excuse me. So Chemical Flood said, "I think I still have a few of my Mega Drive games," and I said, "Which ones did you hold on to?" And he said, "Talmad's Adventure, Home Alone, Lotus Racing 2, Sonic 2, and also Global Gladiators, the McDonald's game." And I was like, "The McDonald's game? I got to hear more about this." And shared the Wikipedia. It's a 1992 game developed by Virgin Games, and it looks like it's based on the McDonald's like franchise broadly, but it's like, and it's funny because I think I remember like seeing footage of this at some point because I remember like, and maybe I even played it. I remember there being like you'd find the McDonald's logo, and that was like the health thing, and it's like very blatantly a McDonald's commercial. But as a video game, and like this is the type of shit that Nintendo was trying to avoid.
They had some stuff like that, I'm sure they did. Some, like,
Oh yeah, like
tie-ins on
they
there.
exist, but I mean, like this is very. It's
They
like
had the, like, Volkswagen Beetle game on, N64,
yeah,
but it's not
that's
really
like
it's not McDonald's, like, eat the
it's a
burgers
little
to
different, right? Like it's a little
just
different to have like
save
a
yourself.
car game that's like sponsored by a car company. It's like all right, fair enough. But let's
I
just say this: in Wikipedia, the last sentence of the like description is the game is based on the McDonald's fast food chain and has a strong environmentalist message. So there you go.
I hope it's about cleaning up your trash and putting them in the bins.
Oh my god, it's a spiritual successor to the NES game Mick Kids.
Yeah, see, so they did have that bullshit on
You're
the
right.
over on the Nintendo side.
You're right. You know what? I stand correct. You know what? It got pretty good reviews. 30 out of 40 from Electronic Gaming Monthly. Not too bad.
Nah, that game's gonna be rare, isn't it?
86% on Sega Master Force. So there you go, everybody. Let me check that one out. I want it now. Look at this. Look at this fucking cover. If you could, that's like the most 90s shit It's like Booger Monster.
Jesus Christ.
Kids got like they've got like super soakers. It's like,
Oh, I love a super soaker.
and the 90s were certainly a special time, huh? All right, folks. Well, thank you guys for joining us here on this very special episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast. Everybody who wrote in for the question block, thank you oh so much. Should we have called it something different this week? It's not the question block. This is the ring block because this is Sega.
The ring block, that sounds.
No, the TV that like Sonic hits and the rings come out. The
Oh,
Ring
okay.
TV. The Ring TV section of the show. Thanks to everybody who wrote in. You guys are great. We love you. Thank you for being a part of the show. If you guys enjoyed this episode, make sure you give us a follow, like it, wherever you get the show. Make sure you go and subscribe. Go check out our sister shows, Nintendo Noise and this is the Flip Screen Games podcast and the Steam Deck podcast. If you want to hear us talk about everything going on in the world of Nintendo or PC gaming, you can go check out those shows. They're a great time. However you choose to get involved or show your support, we thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Flip Screen Games podcast. Remember, write in with your thoughts on Sega's history and future if you want, I guess. You could do that too. All the ways we said before, head over to flipscreen.games. That's the website. Thanks again. For the crew, I've been Pete. He's been Steve. We'll see you next week.